Hello and welcome to Decoding DC. We're the housing and neighborhood stand in Biden's budget plan. Good afternoon. My name is Buzz Roberts. I am the president and CEO of the National Association of Affordable Housing Lenders. NAAHL is the National Alliance of Banks and Mission-Driven Lenders and Investors in Affordable Housing and Inclusive Neighborhood Revitalization. First, I want to thank our sponsors for today's webinars and the webinar series. We have 25 sponsors. You can see them all listed, but I especially want to thank our lead sponsor, PNC Bank. This is the first webinar in a series entitled A Pivotal Time for Affordable Housing in Neighborhoods. We're also going to post today's webinar on our website shortly. Today, we're focusing on what's going on in Washington with the budget bills, and particularly what's called budget reconciliation. There is seemingly endless media attention on whether and how Congress will act on the Biden-Harris proposals, but is a deal either possible or impossible or inevitable? Is President Biden siding with the progressives or is he siding with the moderates? Will housing and neighborhoods win big or lose big? And when will we know? So to help us delve into these questions, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. They are from NAAHL's legislative advisors at Porterfield, Fettig Sears, Dwight Fettig, Jen Reed, and Bryan Blom. So panelists, there is a lot at stake for affordable housing and neighborhood investment in this package, between near $300 and $400 billion by some calculations. We're going to get into that shortly. But first, can you give us some context about the budget reconciliation bill? President Biden campaigned on a Build Back Better agenda, and that was designed to create jobs and lower costs for families. Major elements of that plan include investments in roads, bridges, green energy, housing, education, healthcare, among other issues. But how does Congress formalize some of these agenda items into legislation? We've heard about the hard infrastructure bill and the human infrastructure bill. And what is reconciliation? Dwight, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, Buzz. Happy to, and welcome everybody. And let me start with kind of trying to put what these two bills that we're hearing the most about in terms of the congressional activity and the press coverage, and that's both the Build Back Better reconciliation bill, as you referred to it, Buzz, the budget reconciliation process, which we can talk a little bit about, but also the infrastructure bill, or what's commonly been called around Washington, the bipartisan infrastructure proposal that's already passed the Senate and is awaiting a vote in the House. And the context here that's important, I think, to keep in mind for everybody is that, as Buzz indicated, the Biden-Harris administration had a very formal proposal that they ultimately came forward with, referred to as the American Jobs Plan, which was what a lot of people referred to as kind of the hard infrastructure, the roads, bridges, school, construction, housing, broadband expansion. And then they also had the American Families Plan, which is what people are referring to as the social safety net and the soft infrastructure. And that were things like the universal pre-K and childcare and some of those issues. And so what Congress, I think, decided they wanted to try to do, and this really sort of took hold in the Senate over the summer, which was to focus on, rather than try to combine both of those packages into one large, potentially partisan-only approach that Democrats would take with their very narrow 50-50 majority in the Senate and their also very small majority in the House, rather than sort of try to combine them all into this budget reconciliation process that would ultimately allow them in the Senate to do it with a majority-only vote and avoiding the filibuster. There were enough senators who said, let's try the bipartisan process first. Let's see if there's any elements of these two plans that the president has issued that we can get bipartisan support for, and let's try that. and then we'll see if what's left, and we can always use reconciliation to try to address some of the other issues. And that's how we ended up with this bipartisan infrastructure proposal that did pass the Senate in early August, that got 69 votes. I think it was 19 Republicans and the 50 Democrats, and is now awaiting a vote in the House. And so they're connected because really they were parts of the same two plans issued by the White House. And now in the House, Speaker Pelosi tried to have a vote and was scheduled to have a vote in late September to move the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but had progressives who said, you know what, we're not comfortable voting for that now until we know what's in the reconciliation bill. And since those discussions and negotiations had not sort of developed far enough and we're not far enough along, she recognized she didn't have the votes for it, and she decided to not have that vote. So they're connected in that sense. And because Majority Leader Schumer and others have highlighted the importance of that two-track approach. So that's really where we are. And that's the context, I think, for why these two bills are connected and why we're at this point now where the negotiations among the White House and House and Democratic leadership are focused on the reconciliation or Build Back Better part of this two-step approach.
So what does budget reconciliation mean? I mean, it's a lot of syllables. Sounds like Washington jargon, but it has some real meaning. So what is that and how does it work?
Yeah, I'm happy to start there as well. And Bryan or Jed, feel free to jump in. But what I would say is it's important because it's a process by which you can pass things in the Senate without the threat of a filibuster. And which means you can do it with 51 votes. And in the 50-50 Senate with the vice president casting a tie-breaking vote, it means the Democrats can do it all by themselves. So as a reminder, it's the same process, budget reconciliation, that the COVID relief package that the White House and the Biden administration pushed forward earlier this year was utilized under. The rules around it are unique in the Senate in terms of how the reconciliation process plays out, but provisions have to have a budgetary impact, right? Whether they cost money or whether they raise money, they have to have a budgetary impact. So that's probably the most important element of reconciliation.
And that means that you don't have to go through, you're not exposed to a filibuster process and having to round up 60 votes in the Senate where the Democrats only have 50.
That's right. Yeah, budget reconciliation has been used by a number of administrations to pass kind of key priorities. As Dwight said, they all have to relate to taxes and spending, which is why there's that association with the budget. So oftentimes you'll hear people trying to say, well, why don't we pass, a gun reform or voting rights or something related to budget reconciliation? And that doesn't have that kind of tax and spend component. So that's really the focus. Now, senators still try to get creative with those rules and on what they can include in that measure, but that's the key. And you're right, Buzz. It only requires 51 votes. So in this case, budget reconciliation can be done solely with all Democratic votes.
So the Democrats have 50 senators. What's the problem?
It sounds easy.
Yeah, they're not all the same. They represent varied different constituencies and have different opinions. And obviously the senators that we hear a lot about in the news that I think are really key to this negotiation, and they're going to be ultimately deciding the size and scope of this reconciliation bill, Senators Manchin and Senator Sinema, and we can probably get into a little bit of that later on. Now, I will say that sometimes news articles kind of lump them in together, but they have very different interests. But just, I mean, for example, Manchin has I think on climate in particular, they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. On other issues, they're also on other ends of the spectrum. So sometimes people throw them in the same bucket, but they have their own kind of different competing priorities.
So let's get into affordable housing and neighborhoods in this bill and talk a little bit about what is at stake. Bryan, talk to us a little bit about what's on the tax side first, and then Jen can talk a little bit about what's on the spending side. And we have a couple of slides that can be helpful here.
Yeah, so this could certainly be a historic year for affordable housing and neighborhood revitalization priorities. I mean, if you just look at the numbers in those slides, they're pretty impressive. Obviously, lots of opportunities, but still some hurdles in the way, which we're going to talk about later. So there are a number of tax changes that were included by the Ways and Means Committee as they got their allocation from the budget. And those were, there was the low income housing tax credit, which was an expansion. They're making the new markets tax credit permanent, and then the new credit, Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. And I guess I'll quickly note, obviously, as we just discussed, this is going to be a partisan process, and Democrats are ultimately going to determine what is in this reconciliation bill and if these credits survive at the end of the day. But all of these credits, neighborhood homes, low income housing tax credit, new markets tax credit, were derived from bills that have bipartisan support. And so I think that's important for the longevity of these programs, and they're less likely to get reversed by future administrations. So the neighborhood homes investment credit, which NAAHL has been a leader on, in addition to a number of other organizations. So that was a bill sponsored by Senator Cardin, as well as Senator Coons, Todd Young, Portman, Tim Scott. It's a rehab tax credit for single family homes. And currently there's no existing credit incentive to help dilapidated single family dwellings. So this is a credit that really revitalizes blighted neighborhoods, leverages the private sector to build and rehab homes for low and moderate income homeowners. The legislation has the potential to create 500,000 affordable homes. And it really just, it solves the valuation gap where the cost of rehab or building a home in a distressed community is greater than the post-construction value of the home. And it's modeled after the low-income housing tax credit, where the states allocate the credits. And so moving on to the low-income housing tax credit, which you all are very familiar with, the committee, or the Ways and Means Committee, included about $30 billion in LIHTC provisions, which was even bigger. And this expansion was based off a bill called the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which was a bill sponsored by Senator Cantwell and supported by Young and Portman and a number of other senators. In fact, I think there's about a third of the Senate has signed on to this legislation. And so at these levels, that would create about 1.4 million apartment homes over 10 years. So we're talking big numbers here. And the Ways and Means Committee portion increases state allocations in the 9% credit allocation phased in over 4 years. It also lowers the bond threshold from 50% to 25% for 7 years. Again, in the legislation, they tried to make it permanent. In the Ways and Means Committee, it's over 7 years. And then requires states to set aside 20% of units for extremely low income households. And then it also lowers, and it also requires permanently expands 30% of the difficult development areas DDA basis boost to include developments in rural and tribal areas. So a lot of changes there. And then finally, the new markets tax credit, which has also been around since 2000, been operating under kind of temporary extensions. There was most recently last year's funding bill gave it a 5-year extension, and this makes it permanent. And so those are some of the big tax changes that were included by House Ways and Means Committee. These numbers, of course, will be kind of knocked down during some of the negotiations, but this is the high water mark of where we're operating at.
And Jen, can you walk us through some of the spending side provisions for affordable housing on the next slide?
Sure, yeah, happy to. So the committee put together $322 billion to invest in affordable housing throughout the country. Listed on this slide are some of the biggest investments in various programs. So we have 35 billion for the home investment fund. These are formula grants that go to states and localities that communities use to fund building, buying, and rehabilitating affordable housing. They can also be used to provide direct rental assistance to low-income households. We have 10 billion for the Capital Magnet Fund. This would provide competitive grants to community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, and nonprofit developers, which leverages private sector investments to create or preserve over 170,000 affordable homes. 80 billion for public housing capitalization. This is to address the big capital needs backlog of the public housing stock in the country. 37 billion for Housing Trust Fund to support the preservation and creation of over 330,000 new rental homes affordable to the lowest income households. 90 billion for rental assistance. This includes both housing choice vouchers to increase housing and economic opportunities for low and extremely low income families, as well as project-based rental assistance. 10 billion for home buyer down payment assistance. This would provide first-time, first-generation home buyers with the greater of $20,000 or 10% of the purchase price of an eligible home and financial assistance, including for down payment cost, closing cost, and cost to reduce the rates of interest. 7.5 billion for community restoration and revitalization. This is a new fund that would provide competitive grants to eligible local partnerships led by nonprofits to conduct affordable, accessible housing activities and neighborhood revitalization activities in rural, suburban, and urban localities. And finally, 8.5 billion for the community development block grants, which assists urban and rural communities by expanding economic opportunities and improving quality of life, principally for low and moderate income persons. So now this is what the committee allocated. These numbers are probably not what we're going to see, unfortunately, in the end result, but we can talk about how and what might get whittled down a little bit later.
So thank you. It does sound great, but this was based on the premise of having $3.5 trillion as a top line number for the package. That is not going to happen. So how do you fit the $3.5 trillion of stuff into a much smaller box, a box that might be as small if Senator Manchin had his way as 1.5 trillion? How's that going to work?
So it's difficult to say. There's a couple of different routes that this could take. So Chairwoman Waters gave a press conference recently where she spoke about how she would prefer every program gets a certain percentage cut down rather than eliminating entire programs completely. Another option is to have programs sunsetted at different times, so they might end a little bit sooner. So that would be another way to cut down the costs. It's very difficult to say how it will actually shake out. Right now, it's a conversation that's being had between House leadership and committee chairs. I think House leadership right now is kind of trying to keep the ball rolling and having chairs kind of cut down to around what they think is going to be 1.5 to low $2 trillion amounts, and allow the committee chairs to kind of look at their allocations and see what they can work through to propose their own cuts. So I think that's something that we're going to be seeing happening soon, and it'll determine what is included and what is not.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Jen, real quick, if I could, and just say that I think there's this, internal discussion still very much underway as part of these negotiations with the leadership in the House, the leadership in the Senate, and the White House, and that is, should they try to have fewer programs but fund them more robustly and sort of stand them up in a way that the impacts are going to be felt, sort of more quickly and are likely to sort of survive long term, or should they have lots of these programs sort of stay in place but reduce the number of years in which they may be getting funding and reduce the amounts of funding in hopes that future Congresses will find that these are popular enough and successful enough that they'll want to extend them. And that is a big discussion and a big debate really within the Democratic Party right now as to which sort of approach. Now, it may turn out that a sort of hybrid of those two approaches is ultimately what happens, where some things maybe do end up on the cutting room floor and other things get shaved down in terms of size. But that is definitely a big topic of discussion, and will be as they try to arrive at this final sort of top line number in the next number of weeks.
Yeah, there's a real internal discussion among Democrats on messaging. I mean, a lot of the press so far has been around kind of that top line number, and so I know a lot of Democrats want to talk about kind of more in bullet points, and so they kind of talk about it in buckets. And so a lot of the conversation now is there's kind of a families bucket, a healthcare bucket, a climate bucket on green energy, and a racial equity bucket. And so those are kind of the big themes that they want to talk about. And so where do some of these provisions fall in those thematic buckets? Obviously, for a lot of these affordable housing initiatives, you could argue they fall in multiple buckets. And so that's internally on the Democratic leadership and with the White House, they're trying to figure out how best to message this to get to maximize the most amount of votes. And then, of course, keep the moderates and progressives happy, which is the ultimate question here.
So, Bryan, you mentioned a couple of themes. We're all focused on things like affordable housing. What are the main big ticket items that leaders are really focused on in addition to affordable housing?
Dwight, you want to talk about ticket?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I think, Buzz, the way to think of this is, some of the kind of core proposals that really a lot of the Democrats have been very sort of supportive of. Some even stem from the earlier COVID relief efforts that the White House and the Congress passed earlier this year, which was the expansion of the child tax credit and making that a monthly a distribution rather than waiting for an annual tax filing to receive that benefit. That's widely popular across the Democratic caucus. Now, Senator Manchin and some others have sort of suggested maybe we can means test that tax credit a little bit more than it currently is. And there may be ways to sort of tweak it, but that's certainly one of the elements that I think is widely popular. You also have things like universal pre-K. That is something that I think has a strong sort of bit of support. So you've got childcare subsidies, you've got free community college. Those are all some of the big ticket items. Medicare expansion, providing vision, dental, and hearing is something that Senator Sanders and a few others have really highlighted as an expansion. Speaker Pelosi has wanted to expand the Affordable Care Act subsidies to make the Affordable Care Act even more affordable for those who have had a hard time getting health insurance. There's even been talk of finding ways to expand Medicaid in states where the governors and the legislatures haven't taken advantage of the Medicaid expansion that was available under the Affordable Care Act. So those are some of the real big ticket items that have had a lot of support, broadly speaking, across the Democratic caucus, but also in some cases have the highest price tags when it comes to the costs of some of those changes in either the tax code or in these programs.
And there are also a lot of money for climate change as well.
Correct. Yes, my apologies. Yes, right. I left that out. You're right. There's significant developments on climate. And as Bryan indicated earlier, that has been one of the core themes for the White House in developing the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan was the sort of climate benefit, including sort of climate justice, as it's referred to, in making sure that communities that have frequently not received some of those benefits make sure that they do, and and that's been a big focus, I would say, for the White House, and frankly for the Democratic leadership in the House and Senate. So the combination really of some of these themes, they overlap, and racial equity and climate is one of those that certainly overlap. And then support for families, whether that's the universal pre-K or the child care subsidies or free community college, those are all things that sort of fall into that family bucket, but also can really be a benefit when it comes to racial equity. And I think that's where, we believe, and I think, Buzz, as you know, in some of the conversations that have been ongoing with our champions on Capitol Hill and the White House, they understand the benefit that these programs on the tax credit side, including Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, have when it comes to benefiting the racial equality issue, and frankly, even helping to address climate. So those are areas that I think will continue to be a major focus.
So it's easy to see why some of these more prominent issues could squeeze down, if not squeeze out, things like affordable housing, which just have less attention more broadly. When we hear the media, or perhaps different factions, talk about President Biden is siding with the progressives or President Biden is siding with the moderates, how do we sort that kind of thing out? Is that just the story of the day, or is there real substance behind that?
Yeah, I think there's real substance about it, and we've seen the White House become more and more engaged in the process over the last couple months, and President Biden has done a lot of outreach, both, and invited members of the Progressive Caucus and some of the moderates to the White House. And I see a few questions in the chat already. Again, the questions around Sinema and Manchin. I think they both, first of all, Manchin and Sinema have a very different way of negotiating. Manchin likes to negotiate a little bit more in public, and some of you may have seen he actually earlier in the summer kind of committed to a number of initiatives with Senator Schumer via a signed letter, and said this is what he's comfortable supporting. And so he's kind of been very vocal about some of his demands and priorities. Senator Sinema likes to negotiate kind of more behind the scenes. She has conversations with the White House, but doesn't really like to share kind of some of the things that she's pushing. And so those are two very different approaches. And again, they have two different constituencies. I mean, on the climate initiatives, Senator Manchin, is very protective of fossil fuel industry and the mining industry, and Senator Sinema not so much. And so there's a real friction there on what both of them are asking in terms of that. And on the corporate side too, I mean, Senator Manchin's kind of indicated on where he's comfortable going on corporate tax rates. Senator Sinema's been less clear on that. And so it's really been interesting because they do have those two different personalities on negotiating tactics. And so that's what I think a lot of us are weeding through right now. Dwight, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I'll add to that real quick, and then I might ask Jen to see if she can give a little bit of a House Democratic caucus sort of insight. But Manchin and Sinema are getting a lot of the attention, and for good reason, right? They are critical votes necessary in a 50-50 Senate, and all 50 Democrats are going to have to agree on the final package. But remember, the House majority is relatively small as well for Democrats. And Pelosi can only lose 3 votes. She can't lose any more than 3. And out of 220 or so, that's not that many. So she's got to also thread the needle when it comes to making sure that progressives are happy enough that they're willing to vote for this, and that the moderates in her caucus in the swing districts are also willing to vote for it. Some of them, very famously during the markups and the votes in committee, as the House is trying to move this process forward, for example, on the prescription drug issue that I didn't mention earlier, but has been a big part of this discussion, letting the government negotiate directly, letting Medicare negotiate directly for lower prices, saves up to $700 billion over a 10-year period. And that money would then be turned around and used for some of the Medicare expansions and other healthcare spending. But there were multiple Democratic House members who refused to go along with that. And that really creates sort of a challenge for Pelosi as well. So Jen, I'm not sure if you have anything you want to share there.
Yeah, like Pelosi has a very big progressive caucus that she has to, make sure that she handles appropriately. And we have Representative Jayapal, who feels very strongly about the reconciliation bill being a very large social spending bill that is much needed in the country. And her perspective and the progressives' perspective is that they've already negotiated. They've felt that, the number should have been a lot higher than $3.5 trillion, and they don't want any further cuts. I think you've seen in the press and whatnot that in interviews, progressive members feel that, when they're asked questions about, well, isn't half a loaf good enough? Isn't the infrastructure package good enough? Isn't that the investment that we need in the country? They feel that it doesn't address so many social spending programs that they have been fighting for so long, and they feel that they haven't been able to get that for the country. So they're holding out. And then we have, the more moderate members like Representative Gottheimer and the Problem Solvers Caucus, who feel just as strongly about the infrastructure bill getting done. And Pelosi had made a promise that there would be a vote on that in late September, and that already got pushed. So, there are these competing priorities that Pelosi really has to balance.
So Jen, let me follow up on that. What do we make of things like Pelosi trying to take an infrastructure bill on its own to the floor and then deciding not to ask for a vote for it? Does that tell us that things are in disarray, or is this just sort of a normal part of the legislative give and take? How do you see that? How should we see that?
I think, I don't think they're necessarily in disarray. I think if anybody can get this done, it is Speaker Pelosi. She is very good at counting votes and very good at compromising with members and getting packages across the finish line. So I don't necessarily think that things are just in disarray. I think it's a very difficult line that she has to walk, but I think she can get it done. I do think this is just kind of part of the legislative process playing out right now.
So if housing activities have to get cut back, any ideas of how they would get cut back?
It's very hard to say. It might be easier in a way to kind of talk about what Chairwoman Waters' top priorities are, because I think she'll fight the hardest for those. So things like investment in public housing, the public housing stock in the country is very much in dire need of repair. This is something that Chairwoman Waters has spoken about publicly numerous times for years. So I think she's going to fight hard to have that included for sure, although I don't know that it will be at the number that it's at right now. Things like the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So this is another priority that plays into the Biden administration's racial equity messaging. Housing choice vouchers would go a long way to end the racial segregation that is in housing, because folks can take those vouchers and go to different housing units. So that's something that she would likely feel strongly about as well. Down payment assistance. I think, she really wants to see low income communities have that down payment assistance so that first generation, first time home buyers can afford to purchase a home. And this is also a priority, and Dwight can speak to this as well, of Senator Warner, Senator Warnock, and Senator Wyden. I think, whether it's 10 billion, I think Warnock or was it Warner who asked for 100 billion, I'm getting all my W's mixed up, who asked for 100 billion, but this is a priority of all those senators and Chairwoman Waters. So I think that's something that she would fight to have included as well. Dwight, I don't know if you want to speak to what's going on the Senate side in terms of down payment assistance.
Yeah, and from a process standpoint, I'll mention that too. But I think it's important, Buzz, for everyone to recognize that because of this process of using the budget reconciliation, the House has, conducted, or referring to the House bills, because they're the only bills that have occurred, right? The Senate didn't take the same actions that the House did. In other words, Senate committees did not have votes and move their sections of this combined package the way the House committees did. And that's in part because it's a 50-50 Senate, and having those markups in evenly divided committees was going to be logistically challenging, lots of difficult amendment votes. And the budget rules allow for an unlimited number of amendment votes when a budget reconciliation bill is ultimately brought to the Senate floor. And so Democrats are going to have to take all those votes that Republican senators are probably going to offer anyway. So why do it twice, right? Once in committee and once on the floor. So what that has meant for this process, and getting back to Jen's point, it means that Democratic senators and Democratic chairs, like Senator Sherrod Brown, chairman of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, are negotiating and coordinating closely with their House counterparts so that ultimately these decisions can be a collective one, because both chambers are going to have to pass it. And the House folks need to know what's acceptable to the Senate, because it's a 50-50 Senate. And so that coordination and communication on these issues is occurring. And then specifically to the House down payment assistance, Senator Warnock and Senator Warner, as Jennifer said, are really sort of highlighting those programs. And Senator Warnock, let's be honest, he's in a very high profile position, not only as a member of the committee, but someone who's got a very challenging re-election already next year after just winning, because it wasn't the full term yet. And so the special election requires him to run again. So he's in the middle of a really interesting dynamic. So I think there's going to be certainly some interest by the leadership in the Senate to try to help make sure that some of his priorities are considered in this context as well. But that's an important part of the process to kind of appreciate that this negotiation between House and Senate is now sort of occurring without the sort of benefit of these Senate committees having taken similar actions that the House committees had already taken.
And I'll just
go ahead.
I was just going to add, I know we talked about kind of the tax and spend side for affordable housing, and question about what might get whacked. I mean, I do think there are some people who, some senior leadership who view those two pots through separate lenses, and some of them try to combine it together. We have heard from the White House that they definitely want to emphasize supply side dynamics, and so that would tend to favor some of the credit allocations more so than maybe some of the spend. And I think that Chair Waters maybe feels some of that squeeze, and that's why she's been very aggressive, as Jen said, with press conferences and with press releases, and trying to defend and protect her allocation on the spend side.
So we have a question from a participant who asks if anybody on the right are willing to sign on with this Democratic package and perhaps break from their Republican colleagues.
Yeah, I would say on the reconciliation side, zero. And somewhere between 0 and 0. But the infrastructure piece, which is what Dwight mentioned earlier, there was that break between kind of the hard infrastructure, which the Senate has already passed and had a strong vote with 69 senators. That has still not been voted on by the House. And I do think that there could be some Republicans that join with Democrats in supporting that initiative when and if it gets brought up for a vote. But on the bigger kind of social spend side, I think that some of the tax changes are a little too much for some of the Republican senators. And so there has not been any that have favorably supported the reconciliation package to date.
And Jen, are Republicans in the House any more likely to cross over on a vote like this?
No, I don't think so. I think it's the same in the House as well, unfortunately.
will we get this sort of similar levels of Republican support for what in the Senate was a bipartisan infrastructure package?
I think so, yeah. Depending on the timing of the vote, I suppose. I mean, I think they were initially threatening to hold out until the Democrats had enough votes to pass the bipartisan infrastructure package. So they may still do something like that, but they still may vote to support it.
So what's the next step in this? There have been debate on this now for a few months. What kind of time frame are we looking at for resolving this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Buzz. And I know in the chat we had a question on timing as well. It seems to me that we had that sort of end of September push by Pelosi and Schumer in the White House, and that was in large part driven by this commitment that Jen referred to earlier that Speaker Pelosi had given to the moderates who wanted a standalone vote on the infrastructure bill, and she had agreed that they would have that vote before the end of September. But when it became clear that the votes weren't there, because a number of the progressives said, we're not ready to vote for it. We'll vote for it eventually. We're just not ready to vote for it now because we want to make sure we also get the Build Back Better reconciliation package completed, and we want to know what's in it before we pass the infrastructure bill. So they thought that that would give them some leverage. So then we had to do a 30-day extension because at the end of September 30th, the current highway bill, which gets reauthorized every 5 years or so, was also a part of that bipartisan infrastructure bill in terms of a reauthorization that's required so that these programs can continue. And so Congress passed a 30-day extension of the existing highway bill and transit programs that need that reauthorization. That gets us to the end of October. So that created sort of a new soft deadline, if you will, because the reality is it's not a hard deadline, because if you get to the end of October and you still don't have it all completed, you could do another short-term extension of the highway and transit programs. And that's likely what we're headed towards. We're 16, 17 days away from the end of October. And if that's the case, it's hard to see that the reconciliation discussions and these broad negotiations around a top line number and then how to divide up the money and which programs get how much is likely to be completed. But the goal of Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Schumer and the White House is to see if they can at least have the framework for those for that reconciliation bill for Build Back Better in place, that enough House members are comfortable saying, okay, we're on track now to get that done because we have this framework, we have this agreement, we know this is a framework that can pass the Senate. That would allow House members to then vote more comfortably for the infrastructure bill. That's still going to be a bit of a challenge in the next couple of weeks to try to get that done by the end of October. So if they are not ready by the end of October to complete it then, because that framework is not quite yet in place, then I do think that Thanksgiving, because that's another sort of break for the congressional session, becomes a really important sort of deadline of sorts. It's not, again, not a hard deadline, but it's a created deadline in a way. And it's important not just because it's a break in the calendar. It's important because, remember, December 3rd is a very important date now on the calendar because we have the continuing resolution, as we call it, right? The short-term funding of the government expires on December 3rd. Now, Congress could issue a 2-week extension of that to December 17th. There's already chatter that might occur. And then in December, we also have potentially now the debt limit issue, because the extension of the debt limit that just occurred was a short-term number to get us into December, with some projections that could slide all the way to late December, early January. But in reality, it's an end of December sort of need to do before the holidays. So I think both Pelosi, Schumer, and the White House, all three of them would prefer to have the reconciliation and infrastructure bills done by Thanksgiving so they can turn their attention to the debt limit and the continuing appropriations or the appropriations for the federal government in December.
Just sticking with that for a second, Dwight, could this jeopardize the regular appropriations process? Might we wind up with perhaps a continuing resolution for the entire fiscal year? Or
I mean, that's always possible. Yeah, Bryan, if you want to jump in on that, go ahead.
Yeah, I think our options right now, Buzz, I think, right now we expect the Senate to release a lot of their appropriations bills on Monday, actually. And I think that that will just be partisan. Now for appropriations, remember, you do have to get 60 plus votes. So that's outside the budget reconciliation. So you need bipartisan support there. And I think that your two options are right now, government funding runs till December 3rd, and you could do kind of a full year extension. You could do a short-term kick, which just gets them, buys them until the new year. And then at that point, you could do what they call an omnibus spending package, and that would have bipartisan support. And that would fund a number of government agencies. And so you kind of have the short-term option, you just keep kicking the can down the road, the long-term CR, which is actually a very likely option to your point, Buzz, or the full omnibus, which would have bipartisan support and you could pass with 60 plus votes. But I just want to pick up on what Dwight said. There's not a lot of, there's a lot of soft deadlines coming up on when some of this stuff has to get done. I think a lot of the trains are starting to pile up kind of towards the end of the holiday season, Thanksgiving to Christmas. And so I think it's going to be, unfortunately for our friends on Capitol Hill, a busy holiday season. And so they're going to be working up until the new year. And then I think there's also kind of political pressure and deadlines that are starting to mount. I think that certainly the White House and Democratic leadership feel like they have to get some wins on the board before the end of the year. And so I think that you have, as Dwight said, the hard infrastructure bill, kind of the reconciliation package that we've been talking a lot about today. You also have the defense authorization bill that gets passed every year. You have the debt limit, and then you have government funding. And so those 5 things all have to be dealt with kind of before the end of the year.
So one of the audience questions is, so how do you squeeze down the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act or Neighborhood Homes Tax Credit? You will recall that Ways and Means price tag on that was 17.7 billion. If that full amount can't be sustained, there are a couple of things that could be done to cut it back. One is you could make it a temporary provision rather than a permanent provision by creating a sunset date. That would reduce the costs. Then you'd have to go back to Congress as the sunset approaches and try to get an extension. But there may be a number of other provisions that are also expiring at that time. And so there might be some chance of getting that extension. You could also phase up the neighborhood homes credit so that you start perhaps at somewhat lower than the full volume and then ramp it up over a few years. You could even say, well, this is a new program. It's unlikely that IRS can finish regs and states can really gear up an application system in 2022. So maybe you could defer the formal start of the program until 23. That would be another way of doing it. Although the downside there is then you have less to show when it comes time for any kind of expiration and renewal. So there are a number of mechanisms, but a long-term, if not permanent authority will be important to really setting up an investment market and the broader delivery system among the states and developers and lenders and everybody else who has to be part of the process. And similarly with scale, there has to be a critical mass opportunity here to make it worth everyone's energy. And so those are some constraints, but there are opportunities. Low-income housing has a slight advantage in this respect because it already has a very robust and stable platform. And so it's relatively easy to toggle that up. And if that had to be sunset, then there's an underlying platform already in place that is running. So the risks there may be slightly lower. How do we think this is all going to end? Do you think we're going to have a budget reconciliation bill and an infrastructure bill at the end of the day? To put all three of you on the spot here.
Yeah, I'll start, and then we'll see if Bryan or Jen wants to disagree with me. But I still feel pretty confident, Buzz, that at the end of the day, and maybe that's closer to Christmas, the end of the year, as Bryan suggested, I do think they get to yes. And I think that's in large part because this is being viewed by many Democrats in the House and Senate as really a rare opportunity to make these kinds of changes. They recognize that historically midterm elections tend not to go very well for the party in the presidency in their first midterm, which is obviously coming up next year, a year from now, basically. And that creates an opportunity that they want to strike, given the the very small margin they have in the House and the 50-50 nature of the Senate. There's no guarantee Democrats will have control of both chambers after next November. And I think they recognize, as Bryan said earlier, the real political imperative, right? Going into an election year next year, the ability to show that Democrats with these majorities, as tenuous and narrow as they are able to reach agreement and improve the lives of voters and to help Americans. And that's really, I think, what's at the core of why they, are going to feel strongly about sort of reaching an agreement. I think those are really the two primary reasons. So I still have a high degree of confidence that they'll get to yes, even though it certainly takes a while to get there. And the process, as it's always commonly referred to, it's like sausage making, and it's not a pretty process, but it should get to an end result eventually.
I agree with Dwight. I do think that they will get there. I think for all the same reasons. I think that Democrats know that they're on the spot. They've made a lot of big promises, and I think they know that they need to keep them. I think, they're all in this for good reasons. They have a lot of different constituencies that they serve, and they need to, fight for their constituents' interests. But at the end of the day, I don't think that they miss the big picture. I think they understand what is at stake, and they need this to reflect well on them and on the administration. And I think that will get them across the finish line.
I third the motion. I agree. Dwight's an eternal optimist, but I agree with him in this case that I just think from a political standpoint, they're too bought in, and I do think that there'll be pressure, particularly on the progressives. I think because I think that ultimately any bill that is passed is going to be closer to 2 than we all know. 3.5 trillion is kind of dead on arrival. Based on what Manchin and Sinema have said. I also want to quickly respond. There was a question in the chat. There was rumors about Sinema switching to potentially be a Republican or independent. I don't think that's the case. I know a lot of people said the same about Manchin several months ago or a year ago. And certainly there was the famous instance in 2001 where there was a 50-50 Senate and Jim Jeffords switched from Republican to independent. I think that Sinema and Manchin, to be honest, are probably more powerful in their current capacity in the party than by switching sides. And I think they both understand that and realize that. And so, and if they did switch, which again, I think is a very, 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 very small chance, it would probably be to independent and not fully switching over, unless McConnell can promise them they can share every single committee or something like that, which is not going to happen.
So Bryan, I think I heard you slip in that you thought that the overall size of the deal was more likely to be somewhere around 2 trillion. That's where your current guess is?
Yeah, I stopped betting on politics a long time ago, but I do think that I think the moderates obviously would prefer it to be under 2, and I feel like the progressives want a 2 in that number. And so I think that as close, the range right now is obviously the low water mark of what Manchin said at 1.5. And then I would kind of put the high water mark right now around, 2.3 or 2.2, but I think it ends up closer to 2, and maybe even kind of in the 1.9 camp. I think just slightly under 2 right now.
And I would add to that real quick, Buzz. I think what's going to also kind of start to take hold, because I've heard this now with some Democrats on the Hill, when you combine what the White House and Democrats were able to do in the COVID relief package earlier this year, remember, along with, some of the more direct COVID relief measures, there was a second round of emergency rental assistance. There was this expansion of the child tax credit and making it available on a monthly basis as a direct deposit so that families could get help immediately. There was that kind of effort that is, quite significant when you look back at its impact and the reduction in child poverty and all the benefits that have sort of come about from that. You add in what's scored at a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package that has about $559 billion in new money, but is going to be about $1.2 trillion in investment over a 10-year period. And then you would add on top of that this close to $2 trillion reconciliation package. You're still talking about the kind of investment in this country that haven't seen certainly in an awfully long time, and maybe ever. And if as a percentage of GDP, it's going to be rather significant when you combine all 3 elements. And I think Democrats are starting to think that way and look at that big picture so that they can then really make sure that that the voters understand that these were significant efforts.
Jen, anything to add to that?
No, I think Dwight and Bryan have covered it. I think they've got it right. I am really looking forward to what the finished product is. But yeah, we'll see. I'm optimistic.
Great. Well, we're just about at time, so I want to thank our presenters, Dwight, Bryan, and Jen, for their great work today and their great work every day in partnership with NAAHL and others. So thank you, folks, very much. I also want to thank our sponsors, led by PNC Bank, and remind you that this is the first in our webinar series, and so we will have additional webinars to announce soon, so keep your eye out for that. And with that, we thank you and wish you a great afternoon.